now. Okay, yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Lindsay, if you wanted to say hello to everybody, then I can take it from there whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Will. So good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Heisler. I'm the Business Development and Marketing Manager for Seacrest Services. For those of you who are not familiar with Seacrest, we are a full service management company. We've been providing management services to community associations for over 45 years. We are very excited to be presenting part 2 of this webinar series. We received excellent feedback from our attendees on part 1 that took place on May 27th. For those of you who are unable to make it, please reach out if you have not already received a link to the recording. We'd be happy to send it out to you so you can view it at your own convenience. Here at Seacrest, we really appreciate partnering with reputable community association vendors like Association Reserves, and we hope that you guys enjoy today's course.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, I appreciate it. Everybody out there, thanks for joining us today. My name is Will Simons. I'll be teaching the course. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping first, just here in the beginning. This course is going to be called Reserve Funding Methodologies. And as Lindsay mentioned, this is kind of the part 2 or follow-up to the prior course that we taught, which is called Fundamentals of Reserves. We did record that last one, so if anybody was not able to attend last time, feel free to reach out. We can definitely send you a recording of that. There is some important content in that course that might be relevant to today's material, particularly the whole section on percent funded. So if you didn't make that, feel free to reach out. We can get that in touch with you. As part of the registration process, you should have been asked to provide your first name, last name, and CAM license number. We should have that on file, but if you're unsure, no big deal. Go ahead and send us an email if you want to just make sure that we have your CAM license number. I don't want to give the impression that this course is only for managers, board members, committee members, just interested members of the industry. Anybody who's looking for information about reserves, you're in the right place. We will be sending out a follow-up email that's going to have copies of the slides for the whole course, as well as a copy of this recording. So please feel free to take notes as you go along. But if you do miss something, you'll get another chance to see that later on. So we'll be sending that out probably within the next couple of days, maybe by the end of this week. Okay, let's see. I'm going to turn off my camera here, but I will be back on. We're going to do the course itself, which will run for maybe about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then same as last time, open it up for Q&A. So feel free to use the Q&A button on the bottom of the Zoom taskbar, not the chat button. Use the Q&A button. That will populate a list of questions, which I can go through at the end of the class. So let me continue with our introduction here in just a sec. Okay, I'll take a moment to introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. As I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. Been with the company now since 2008, a little over 14 years. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. That comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. As of right now, we've got 5 total credentialed reserve specialists amongst our Florida staff, and then we've got a few dozen more spread out around the country in our other offices. I have lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community. We had a budget there of a little over $1 million. And the reason I always like to point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, right? And I've worked with volunteers, worked with committees, worked with, obviously, with our property manager. I know what it's like to take on that responsibility. And so I salute those of you who are out there doing this on behalf of your communities. Thank you very much. And I hope this is good information that you'll get here today. Okay, we are the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the country. We've been in business now since 1986. We've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies. I think I actually have to update our prior slide. It's up over 70,000 reserve studies we've done now. We've got offices from coast to coast. We have actually more credentialed reserve specialists on our staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which of course includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, other residential properties. But we do have a great deal of experience with other property types too. So office buildings, hotels, worship facilities, country clubs, so on and so forth. Our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, so we're not an engineering firm or an accounting firm, but rather a specialized consulting firm, which is focused on doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies, which will help those clients to forecast and budget for their major projects. So if we do our job well, if we prepare a good reserve study, and then our client property follows that plan, hopefully the benefit of that is they reduce the risk of financial distress, typically in the form of special assessments or bank loans for major projects. So if you'd like any additional information, please visit our website. The website down there in the bottom right is reservestudy.com, or feel free to shoot me an email. My email address, we'll have that up on the screen later as well. That's wsimons, so WSIMONS at reservestudy.com. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so again, kind of like last time, just 2 sections to this course. The first part of this class is going to be a little bit more philosophical, right? The reasoning behind why this is important to have reserves at all, right? Why is it not okay for associations to just pass a special assessment or go out and get a loan every time it needs to take on some big project, right? In our last class, I spent a lot of time, again, talking about that percent funded concept, which is going to be very important for us to learn now. Now that you understand what that means and how that's used, it'll make a lot more sense when we turn into the heart of this course, which is that detailed overview of the 2 different reserve funding methodologies, the pooled method and the straight line method. So again, just another reminder, a little plug there. If you did not catch our last class, the fundamentals of reserves class, definitely would encourage you to go back and watch that, because in that course, we talk a lot more about just the basics of, association accounting, what a reserve study is, how they're used, what types of studies we do, that kind of thing. Yeah, the main concept you want to take from that and use here is percent funded. But let's kind of zoom out here for a bit. Why have reserves at all? Okay. Now, just to put this in perspective, let's frame it as kind of a hypothetical question. Okay, so if you're asking yourself, what are reserves for? Why do associations collect this money and put it aside? You might pose it in the frame of a question, is that money for the present day? Is it for the here and now? Or is it for the future? Okay, so maybe take a moment, ponder that for a second. Okay, so if you are out there thinking that reserve money is for the future, please let me convince you that it's actually for the here and now. Okay, let me explain what we mean by that. I think it's a misunderstanding to think that reserve funding is the process of saving up for a future project. Okay, the reason why that's not a great approach is that oftentimes there's a very good chance that the current owners, right, the people who live in the association now, won't be there by the time that future project takes place, right? So to them, it kind of feels like it makes sense that, hey, we shouldn't be funding reserves towards some project that I won't be around to benefit from. I'm not going to be there when that happens. But let's think of that in a little bit deeper way, right? If instead you think that funding the reserves as part of your annual budget is paying the current bill of deterioration, right, for that deterioration that's happening in the present day, that's the more appropriate way to think of it. It's more like a pay-as-you-go type model. So let's just talk that through. Let's give you a quick example. Let's say that I just bought a unit in a brand new condo building, right, new construction. Let's assume that the roof on that building has a 20-year lifespan, a 20-year useful life. Now, if I'm going to live in that building for the first 15 years of the building's existence, you can argue that I'm going to enjoy the use and value of 15 years out of that roof's life, not to mention all the other building components, right? The mechanical systems, the amenities, so forth. But now after 15 years, if I'm going to go sell my unit and the incoming buyer who's going to buy it from me is going to live there for the next 15 years. Let's see how that plays out. Remember, the roof has a 20-year useful life. So after 5 years, right, that person's going to be there. They're going to buy the unit from me. They start their ownership experience. They've been there for 5 years, and now that roof needs to be replaced. This is where it gets tricky. Now, if I had not been charged accordingly during the time that I lived there, meaning I was not contributing towards the cost of the roof through reserve funding, then that new buyer is essentially going to get stuck with the full cost of the replacement project, even though at that point they will have only lived there for 5 years or 25% of the roof's life. They're being asked to pick up the tab for the full 20 years worth of its cost, right? They're paying their share of the life of that roof, but also my share, even though I've moved away. Now, if you're wondering, well, so what? Well, if you're the second buyer and you're deciding between associations to buy into, right, in the beginning, if I'm looking at this association and doesn't have a healthy reserve fund, that means that me as the new buyer, or that person as the new buyer, is going to be exposed to more cost and probably a higher chance of special assessments, which will be required to make up for the years during which I was not being charged for my share of that cost. Okay, so very, very important thing to understand. Reserve money, the byproduct of budgeting in the present is that, yes, you accumulate money over time, and after 20 years, you have enough to go buy a new roof. But everybody who lives under that roof over the course of its entire life, they should be paying towards that project because that offsets the loss of value that occurred while they did live there. Okay. So in our business, we talk about these 4 reserve rules. First up, these expenses are inevitable. Okay, there's absolutely no getting around the fact that air conditioning systems need to be replaced, elevators need to be modernized, roads need to be repaved, so on and so forth. Number 2, the board is responsible. Okay, the board is the group that's entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all the owners. Okay, next, when these projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive. We see this kind of thing all the time, especially in the case of, again, roofs, but also concrete restoration, anything that's attached to the building envelope that, if you let it go, it's going to get worse and worse as time goes on. Most importantly, the homeowners, right? The owners in the association, they are always the ones who get stuck paying the bill, right? There's no Uncle Sam, there's no government bailout coming for associations that don't have adequate reserves. For those that have been looking at this, even, there's been some legislation that was proposed that might create like some sort of, lending program for buyers. That's still not a grant. That's not a gift, right? The owners in these associations will always be the ones who end up picking up the tab one way or the other. So just as there are those 4 rules for reserve planning, we talk about these as the only 4 options for how to eventually pay these bills, okay? Now, the first and best option, of course, is to have that healthy reserve fund, okay? No question about it. The second best option is actually to pass special assessments when these projects come along. Now, if you're looking at this, it should be obvious that a bad situation is going on when the second best option on the table has a skull and crossbones warning on it, right? And if you've ever lived or managed, lived within or managed a community association that always is relying on special assessments, hopefully you understand what I mean by that. That's a toxic thing for a community to go through, right? This is how boards get, thrown out. This is how management companies get fired. This is what causes people to be up in arms and show up at the annual meeting with their proverbial pitchforks, right? So after special assessments, the next best option would be to take out a loan or a line of credit to pay for some project. Now, the reason that I have that ranked after or behind a special assessment is because, of course, the cost of the project will in that case be greater because you're financing it. There's going to be some interest charges. Now, what happens if you don't do any of those 3, right? You don't have reserves and you're unwilling to do special assessments or borrow money. Well, then the only natural result is that your property starts to fall into disrepair, right? If you're not paying any money out of pocket upfront to take care of something, then ultimately you're just going to see a decline in property values because there's newer, nicer buildings that are going to pop up all around you. And if you're not maintaining a competitive place in the market, then that's going to happen. You're going to lose out in property value. Okay, some of the specific benefits of having reserves in particular, starting up here at the top, you shouldn't have really any surprises, or at least a much lower chance of getting caught by surprise. Okay, if you're funding your reserves, if you're paying attention, then typically you're going to be tracking the remaining life expectancies of those components. And when you do that, you'll have the option to plan ahead, to prepare for what you need to do and get ready for when something needs to be replaced, rather than reacting to that and getting caught by surprise when something fails. Okay. Now, when you're planning ahead, that also gives you the chance to shop around and to select from different providers, right? You have time on your side, which gives you the ability to seek out more bids, try to minimize costs, maybe by working with different contractors. You know, for example, maybe you talk to a painting company and you can ask them, look, we know we need to do this within the next 2 years. Is there a downtime? Is there a more advantageous time of year for us to work with you? Maybe we can get a little bit lower price that way. On the flip side, if you're always reacting to stuff, if you're always, waiting until something bad has happened to do something about it, you're not good. That's not going to work out. For example, if you're calling out to, a cooling tower repair company because the tower just failed and it's the 4th of July and the building's sweltering, you're probably going to pay a higher fee than you would have because it's an emergency, right? You don't have any options at that point. So the next point here, bottom circle there, about minimizing exposure. This is mostly relevant to the board members out there. What I mean by this is that if you are proactively taking care of your property, I think you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty, which hopefully in turn gives you better protection against any potential complaints or maybe even lawsuits that might come from the owners, right? If you can demonstrate that you're doing everything you can on a proactive basis, not waiting until, somebody files a complaint to act, that's a better way to discharge your fiduciary duty. The last point on this slide is that if you are doing all of those 3 things, hopefully that will lead to increasing property values, right? It makes sense. The communities out there that are doing a good job of reserve funding, to me, tend to have better curb appeal, right? They're more up to date with respect to their technology. They have more modern amenities than those that don't. And all of that contributes to a better ownership experience for the people who live there, which again, in turn, makes them more attractive to potential buyers. Okay, we're going to close this section out in just a moment. Of course, the opposites are true if you don't have a healthy reserve fund. Okay, you're going to be more exposed to surprises, which can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and ultimately possibly a decline in property value. And the real problem with this vicious cycle is that once communities start going down this path, it becomes more and more difficult to break out of it each year. Okay. So that, obviously a fairly short, simple overview. I think just by virtue of you all having attended this class, hopefully you agree that reserves are important. I hope I don't have to work too hard to sell you on the fact that special assessments are bad. But let's dig in now to the second part of the class, which is, I think, maybe the more important part, at least for some of you guys out there. I know we always get a lot of questions on the differences between straight line and pooling. So we're going to break this down. As I'm talking, I'm noticing that the chat feature has still got a lot of messages coming in. If you do have any specific questions about the course material or anything else, feel free to use the Q&A button, because that'll actually populate a list of questions for us at the end. So, okay, let's dive into this second topic here. So first up, I'm going to go over what we call the straight line method. The other term for this method, this approach, is called the component method. The reason for that is because in this approach, all of the components, all the reserve line items, are treated separately from a funding standpoint. Now, personally, I've always thought of this as being the old-fashioned way. More and more communities are switching to the pooled method every day. Part of the reason why this is the old-fashioned way is because actually prior to 2002, at least in the state of Florida, this was the only option. This is the only option that associations could use to fund their reserves. Now, the way that the way I like to characterize this is that it is actually maybe more simple in theory, but when you actually try to implement this and put it into practice, especially for a bigger property, it falls apart. It becomes very, very troublesome very quickly. All right, so the way that I've found to best explain this method is to have you think of each, category of reserve components or each individual component as being handled in a separate bucket of money. Okay, so for this example, let's assume we're talking about these 5 buckets here: roofing, elevators, painting, mechanical, and pavement. Okay. So when you're preparing the budget, you're figuring out your reserves using this method. The first thing to do is you're going to determine the amount of funding going into each one of those separate buckets each year using a fairly simple calculation. Basically, what you do is you take the cost of that component, you subtract out any existing funds that you've already saved for that, and whatever the difference is, you're going to divide that remaining difference by the remaining useful life of the component. The result of that calculation then tells you the amount that we will need to quote unquote fully fund that component in the following year's budget. Okay, and I'm intentionally using quotation marks there on fully fund, as we'll see in a few minutes. Okay, so let's just do a quick example. Let's say that we're preparing our budget, we're figuring out how much to reserve for our roof, roof reserves, our roof category. If you understand, again, this analogy that the total cost of the bucket, or excuse me, the total volume of the bucket represents the total cost to replace the roof. And if you look at the existing reserve funds as being the cash that's already there, right, the contents of the bucket now, the difference, this empty portion, this is something that you might refer to as the unfunded balance, okay, which is really just, again, the difference between the cost of the new roof minus the money you've already saved. All right. Now, if I put some actual numbers to it, this maybe comes into more focus. So let's say that the cost of that roof is $200,000 and this association already has $140,000 in existing roof reserves, cash on hand. Of course, that means the unfunded balance, the difference, is $60,000. Now, if I'm figuring out my budget for that year, right, I need to know how much do I need to fund that roof reserve in next year's budget. I'm going to take my $200,000 cost, subtract out my $140,000 in existing reserves, and divide that difference by the remaining useful life of my roof. Okay, so let's say that we've determined that that remaining life is only 3 years. I'll take 200,000 minus 140,000 gives me that $60,000 difference. 60,000 divided by 3 years means I need to put away $20,000 a year into reserves for the next 3 years in order to fully fund my roof. You can kind of see the writing on the wall. The target is 3 years from now, at the end of my roof's life, I want to have all the money I need to replace it. So where I am today means I need to put aside 20 grand a year for the next 3 years. Now, that's just one example, right? So as you're moving forward with the budget, you're going to repeat that same approach, that same process for all of your remaining buckets, right? All of your remaining categories, your components. Now, as that happens over time, you can see how you might end up with a variety of different funding positions. So depending on how accurate your assumptions were for life expectancies and costs, what we usually see is that some associations will have certain accounts that are really well funded and others that are not, right? They're in kind of a deficit or a weak position. And now in our view, when you again zoom out, that makes for an inefficient distribution of all of the total actual reserve cash that's on hand. In other words, you have money that's locked up in one account, right? And like in this example, maybe painting or pavement. But if you're looking at a mechanical project to do, it would be very advantageous to just transfer some of this money here, and therefore we don't have to do as much funding towards mechanical, but that's where things start to get complicated. right? Some of the problems that we see in this method, first of all, it's very often the case that there has been no prior reserve fund established for some important component, something like concrete restoration, for example, or the funds are just too broadly defined. For example, sometimes we'll just see one large combined reserve account that's labeled as, mechanical. And the idea there is that that single mechanical reserve bucket is going to try to capture everything from the security cameras to the fire alarm or ELSS system to the cooling towers. And in reality, all of those have very different life expectancies, very different replacement costs. If they're just broadly combined into one big category, it starts to become very complicated math to find out, well, how much money actually needs to go into this bucket, because it's then being distributed to these actual, range of different things. For you managers out there, I'm sure you've probably seen this from a management standpoint. We think the component method is much more of a headache. The reason for that is that under the method, as I kind of alluded to a moment ago, the Florida statutes require that the owners have to vote to approve the moving of funds from one place to another. So for example, from elevator reserves to parking lot reserves. Now, if you've been around associations long enough, you know that getting a quorum and passing a vote for anything typically is a very difficult task, but I would say especially so when it comes to moving money around, right? Residents are quite often skeptical of the board. Maybe they're hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand the situation, which sometimes means that the board, the manager have to call special meetings, maybe get the attorney involved, post notices, send out emails, and that gets even more complicated when residents may be seasonal, snowbirds that are gone for a big part of the year. So very, very difficult logistically. But I think the most important problem is that because it is more conservative, because these associations are not making the most efficient use of the sum of all their available cash, that actually ends up costing the owners in that community more money each year to fund the reserve according to this method, right? So just a quick aside, at the end of each year as a company, we try to look back on all the studies we've done in that prior year. And when we have clients that are using this method, the straight line method, we'll do their studies using both options. We'll say, okay, if you stay with the straight line method, this is what the recommendation is going to be for funding reserves. If you pooled that money together, this is what the recommendation would be in that case. And just to give you some real numbers, I mean, again, we're talking about doing hundreds of studies a year. We found that the average difference between those two methods was 200%. So what that means is that for those clients that are straight line funding, that will require triple the amount of money out of pocket from the owners to do it that way than if they were to pool the reserves together. Okay, and we'll talk about pooling in just a moment, but just think about that for a second, right? Given that pretty much every single association out there is trying to cut their costs, lower their assessments to the owners, I would say this is a very easy, very straightforward way to try to do that. Pool your reserves. That is a very effective way to try to reduce the cost burden to the ownership. And we see this all the time. You've got more and more communities in Florida that are pooling their reserves and just, never looking back from there. All right, so let's talk about this better option, the pooled method. This is something that also is known as the cash flow method. And, unequivocally, in our opinion, this is the way to go. Again, for background, this pooling method has only been approved in Florida since 2002, but because we're a national company, we have offices throughout the US, clients in all 50 states, I can tell you that outside of Florida, pooling reserves is universal, okay? We have 12 offices throughout the country. Our Florida office is the only one that still has any clients using straight line method. Now, just to compare the two, I mean, the pooling method, I would say, is maybe more complex in theory, but once you understand it, once you understand how it works, you have the right tools to execute it, it actually becomes much simpler for most associations for budgeting. So the question typically will come up whenever I give this presentation: if we have straight line reserves now, but we are interested in making the switch, okay, Will, you've convinced us, we like the idea of pooling. How do we go about doing that? Well, here's this slide to kind of talk through that process. So to be real clear, first and foremost, a board of directors can create a new pooled reserve account all by itself. All right. For example, the board can say, as of this upcoming 2023 fiscal year, all of our new incoming reserve money is going to go into this pool of funds. So to be very specific, that creation of the new pooled account, that does not require the owners to vote. It's only if the association wants to move cash, to move money from existing straight line reserve accounts into that newly created pooled fund, that is when the owners have to vote and approve it, right? And then the reason is that it's basically the same idea from the state's perspective as moving funds from one reserve account to another, which is called a non-scheduled use of those funds. So you actually have the same vote process that's required as if you were moving money from painting reserves to elevator reserves. The act of pooling, though, is a one-time process. It's not like you have to take that vote every year when you adopt your budget. Always recommend that if you're considering doing this, you talk to your CPA, maybe talk to your attorney, make sure you're going through the process correctly, make sure your owners are educated about the pros and cons of both. Obviously, if you have a good reserve study provider, we can help you with that as well. But this, to me, it's a no-brainer. We've talked to many clients that have switched from straight line to pooling, and they're much happier with the outcome. Typically, they're saving themselves a good chunk of money by doing that as well. All right, so again, we're going to go back to this bucket analogy to explain how pooling works. So if, imagine that I've taken those 5 buckets that we talked about a few minutes ago, and I'm going to dump all those buckets, take all that cash and dump it into one big bathtub, right? Once I've done that, I have effectively removed the labels from any of those specific categories of reserve funds. They actually go away. Now I just have one big pool of money that is collectively available for any component that's on my reserve schedule. So there is no such thing anymore as a roof reserve dollar or a painting reserve dollar or an elevator dollar. It's all reserve money that can be spent much more effectively, much more efficiently. So we'll talk through the process of how you develop your actual budget using this method, but the very first step of that process is the same whether you're talking about straight line or pooling, okay? And that's to have a very accurate component list. That is the foundation of any good budget. You've got to have good underlying data. It doesn't matter if you're using straight line or pooling if your assumptions for life expectancies and costs are not accurate, right? And that's, we talked about that in the last class. That's really the benefit of having a reserve study done, is that you end up with that foundation of a good component list to work with. But once you've done that, right, once you have that foundation, you've got your list of components, you have accurate figures for life expectancy and cost, the next step is to look forward and actually put together a timeline of expenses, right? So it might look something like this. Typically, a reserve study will have a 30-year forecast, something like that. And what you see is a future projection based on when each component reaches the end of its useful life and whatever its replacement cost is. You can see a timeline of expenses. How much are you going to spend in any one year? And there's probably going to be some years in there where there is no spending, but that doesn't mean you're not collecting reserves, because again, there's some big mountains to climb along the way. So once you've done that, okay, once you know what those future expenditures will look like, the next logical step is to determine how much money needs to go into that pooled reserve account in order to meet those expenses, right? Conceptually pretty straightforward, but let's talk through the steps. The first thing to do is to determine your starting point. How much in total do you have in reserves in your pool of funds at the start of this next fiscal year? From there, you start to do some cash flow modeling. Okay, the first thing you want to do is plug in an assumption for how much you think you can collect, and maybe also now some interest earnings, right? This is another big advantage over the straight line method, which is that you can now factor in money you earn on your money, right? Interest. The straight line method really only looks at one fiscal year at a time. There is no modeling the future. So now that we can look into the future, we can assume that we're going to earn some money, and that helps reduce the amount you have to collect from your owners. Okay. Well, let's stick in that first year, right? So we have our starting point. We model in an assumption for how much we think we can collect. Now we're going to have to look at that forecast of expenses and see, how much are we going to spend? And you do the math. Your starting cash position, add in your assumption of income, subtract out your expenses, and you see where that leaves your pooled reserve balance going into the following year. Okay, move on to year 2. You look at the start of that next year, obviously, you have to make sure that there's still some money in the bank, right? That you haven't spent it all in the first year. If you do, go back to step 1, right? Then you will obviously need to assume a higher contribution rate in the year before, because you're never allowed to design a plan that has you running out of money. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, the beauty of this process is that if you're using an Excel spreadsheet or any type of software, you can model the same types of projections for many years at a time. Remember, we're looking out typically 30 years. So you set up some formulas. It only takes you a couple minutes to model out many years at a time, and you see how much money you will be spending over this entire projection, and therefore how much you need to be contributing over all those years in order to keep your reserve account balance at a safe, healthy level. Now, that's a very important point to make here. There are definitely differences of opinion over what is a safe level, what is a healthy level to have in reserves. And again, this is talking about pooled reserves. Basically, there are 3 possible objectives you can take here. One is what we call baseline funding, and then there's full funding, and then threshold funding. I'll talk about each one in that order. So first up is baseline funding. Now, I'm not going to, paint this with a pretty brush here. This is not good. This is the riskiest option on the table. Now, it is perfectly legal to do, but for most communities, this is a bad idea. When you're baseline funding, the objective is that you're figuring out what is the bare minimum amount of money that I need to put into reserves in order to keep my account balance above 0 in all future years, right, throughout my forecasted timeline. Now, I'm going to make this as clear as I can. When I talk to managers, even to CPAs in the industry, there's a disconnect in the terminology here. The problem is that if you talk to most people in Florida and you ask them what they mean by fully funding a pooled reserve account, what they will describe to you is what I'm now telling you is actually called baseline funding. It is the minimum required by law unless you get a vote of your owners to approve something less. And that's really what most boards and what CAMs want to know at budget time. What's the amount of money we need to put into our budget so that we don't have to get the owners to vote and approve anything else? And the law says that that amount, the number that needs to be put in your budget to avoid that vote, is the amount that would be required to keep any positive cash balance in the reserves over time. And in this example, anything above 0 is acceptable. So this is actually what is in the legislation, right? This is what's published right now with respect to pooled funding. Basically says that your contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time, your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows, but that's basically it. There's no other requirement. Now, if you take the time to read this closely and interpret it, the term fully funding is actually not used anywhere with respect to the pooled method. The closest thing that we can find is the term sufficient funds. And if you drill down on that, the DBPR has a manual that they publish, which is a guide that's used by managers and board members, and it talks you through how to design a pooled funding calculation. Now, in this example, this official publication from the DBPR, this example association they get to a point where they have $4 in their reserve account. And the state labels that as sufficient. So before we move on at all, think to yourself out there, does anybody out there, if you're a board member or manager, if this is the first time you've ever heard of pooled reserves, Is it ever a good idea for a community to have $4 in its pooled reserve account? Okay, and we obviously don't think so. Hopefully you recognize that's a very dangerous approach to take, because obviously if you're doing the bare minimum, it only takes one thing going wrong to completely blow up that plan, right? It could be some project that happens a little earlier than you anticipated, or something that costs a little bit more than you thought. The problem is that if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, you have no margin for error. Okay, and the chances that you will need to pass special assessments or go out and get loans for something become very, very high. And again, if one of the main reasons to even go down this road of funding reserves is to try and prevent special assessments and loans, then I would argue that baseline funding is not a very reasonable strategy to take. Okay, this is actually what this looks like in the real world. So this is an example of baseline funding. If you look at the top left corner of this table here, you're going to see that the first column, vertical column here, this is all 30 years of this plan. So it begins 2022, goes out to 2051. Looking from left to right now, you're going to see the numbers that correspond to each fiscal year. All right, now you've got your starting reserve balance, you have your fully funded balance, which is, again, a theoretical number. We talked about that in our last class, how to calculate that, what that means. If you haven't been exposed to this before, we'll definitely send out a recording of the fundamentals class so you can catch up on that. But if you did attend that, or if you understand this already, you know that the starting reserve balance divided by the fully funded balance tells us percent funded. And a given level of percent funded translates into a given risk of special assessments. So on the right-hand side of this table, this is all the actual cash flow stuff. We have a reserve contribution assumption, whether or not there's any loans or special assessments, any interest income that we can factor into the plan, and then is there any expenses taking place in that year. So I'm going to start with the starting reserve balance here. I'm going to add in my reserve contributions, add in my interest income, and then subtract out any expenses, which brings me to my starting balance going into the following year. At that point, I can recalculate percent funded. And if I just repeat that process over and over again, you start to see, am I collecting enough to meet these expenses? Now, in this particular plan, there is a point where the association starting with a certain amount of cash, they're adding in their contribution for that year, but then they have a huge amount of spending going on, right? If you look at the last prior couple of years, almost $2 million worth of spending, which brings them down to a weak point of having only $245 in the bank. Now, again, this is perfectly legal from the state's perspective. This is, it's never going below zero. It's obviously getting very, very close. But the point is that, this would be satisfactory in the sense that the board, or excuse me, the members would not have to vote on this plan. The board could do this, and this would be considered sufficient. But in reality, you see what's happening. There's community is starting in a strong position, almost 90% funded, but then slowly whittling down that position, right, until a point where they're very, very weak. They go from a position of strength to a position of weakness where they're going to be a high percentage of financial distress, high percentage risk. Okay, the fully funded balance at that time is almost 400 grand. If they only have a couple $100 in the bank, that's obviously not a good thing. Okay, I've talked about now the minimum requirement. We'll now switch over to the other end of this spectrum, which is what we call full funding, or fully funding the reserves. Now, to be really careful, I'm using the term full funding, again, in the context of pooled reserves, which is different from straight line, as we talked about. But this definition of full funding, this comes from National Reserve Study Standards. And as I said before, most people in Florida have a concept of fully funding, which is, what I just showed you on the last couple of slides, something that's now you understand to be actually baseline funding. It's the weakest thing you can do. Now, for more background, CAI, Community Associations Institute, they adopted these National Reserve Study Standards way back in 1998, right? A full 4 years prior to when pooled funding became allowable in Florida. Obviously, it would have been nice if when they did that they would have, adopted the consistent existing terminology that was already on file, but that ship has sailed. What I want you to understand, though, is that the definition of the term full funding means setting the goal of the plan, the objective, to attain and maintain the reserves at or near 100% funded. Again, that's why it's so important to understand that concept, and definitely encourage you to refresh on that if you need to. This is what that looks like, right? So same example, right? Same starting position. This is the same association, same list of components, same expenses. But instead, the difference here is that instead of seeking a target of just staying above zero, going down to that very low point, now the goal is to try to reach 100% funded. Now they're already starting at a strong position, which is good. But now at a slightly higher contribution rate, all they're trying to do is, two things: not only meet the expenses, but improve upon this cash position so that the risk of any further distress in the future goes effectively to zero. Okay. They're slowly accumulating maybe even a little bit more money than they need from one year to the next, but the benefit of that is they're building up a very, very healthy cushion of reserve funds. It's another way to look at this. Okay, on this chart, we're measuring percent funded here on this vertical axis and time here on the bottom. So from over these 30 years, the green dots in this plan represent what I was just showing you, the full funding contribution rate. If they do that, they go from about 90% funded gradually up to 100%, take a little dip when they have some big projects to do, but then they recover nice and gradually, very smoothly, never getting into trouble. The orange dots here represent that baseline funding plan. Now notice for the first 10 years or so, they start off, about the same, and then they're not doing too bad, but then they get hit very hard by those big projects that have to take place. They bounce, way down here to a weak position, about 20% funded, recover a little bit, and then go all the way down to that position where they have $245 in the bank, never getting back up to the strong level that they started at. Okay, so what is this? And I guess one last thing to point out, the current plan, the purple dots here, that's if this particular community just kept doing what they were already doing. And we see that actually bottoms out and goes all the way to zero. In fact, this would probably go negative and require special assessment just to get back up again. But what does this mean, right? So what is the difference between fully funding, seeking 100% funded, and baseline? Well, in this particular example, the difference was between $94,500 and $70,500. It's a difference of about 34% more. And believe it or not, that's actually a higher difference than we usually see. In most cases, the difference between baseline and full funding is more like 15 or 20%. But even in this example, even at 34%, in the real world, this is a real client of ours, that worked out to $15 per unit per month. Okay, think about that. Less than $1 a day per owner meant the difference between doing the riskiest thing possible and the safest thing possible, right? So it's not a huge amount of money, but compounded over time and extrapolated over time, that's where you see the real benefit, is just putting away that little bit extra means all the difference. Okay, and again, with the purple dot plan here, the current plan, we can show them, look, either way, you can't just keep doing what you're doing. You're going to run out of money. But if you're going to increase your budget, if you're going to commit to reserve funding going forward, while you're at it, let's do that in the most responsible way possible. Okay, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this last option because I think it's fairly simple to understand. The third option on the table is what we call threshold funding. And really, that's just any objective between baseline and full. Right. So what happens here is you pick a target and then you design your funding plan accordingly. So instead of becoming 100% funded, you might say we want to become 70% funded, or you can express it in terms of dollar values. We want to make sure that we never drop below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund. Right. Now, one of the problems with this approach is that, to me, this is more subjective, right? You can have one board in one fiscal year that says they want the threshold to be 50% funded. And the next year, you've got a new board in place and they say, no, we're okay with 20% funded. Let's set that as our low water mark. Well, either way, that's going to have a potentially huge effect on the amount of money going into reserves and what the risks of that plan would be down the road. These are usually pretty unique scenarios. If we ever do a threshold funding model, it's usually when a client has some specific goal in mind. But as we talked about on the last slide, more often than not, it usually just makes sense to fully fund, right? Set 100% funded as your target, than to pick some arbitrary number less than that. Okay, our last main concept for today, I've got maybe about 4 more slides and then we'll go to Q&A. So again, feel free to start using the Q&A button for any questions and we'll go through those. But to bring this home, I'm going to now talk to you about one of the most frustrating parts of being a reserve study provider in Florida these days. Now on the screen in front of you, I've got a paragraph that I copied from the Florida Administrative Code, which is basically the state's official interpretation of what is written in the statute. And in this section here, where they talk about pooled reserve funding, they have this one sentence at the end, which talks about the funding plan not allowing for balloon payments. Now, I'm very confident that when they wrote this, they had good intentions. I think the inspiration behind that sentence was to prevent boards of directors from intentionally kicking the can down the road. But the term that they used to do that, in this context, balloon payment, has a very different understanding in most contexts. The general understanding of that term, balloon payment, typically describes a situation where, for example, you have a mortgage, and for the majority of the term of that mortgage, the borrower pays a certain amount of money each month, and at the very end of the term, they have one single final payment, which is much larger than any of the amounts that came before it. Now, if you think of how that would play out in association terms, it makes sense why that's not fair. Basically, they don't want an association to do the minimum, some small amount of funding for many, many years, and then at some point in the future, plug in a much higher amount in some particular year when a big project is going to take place. So, for example, let's say there's a townhome type condo building that needs to replace its tile roofs. That will almost always be the largest expense in their reserve schedule by a huge margin. And let's say that this community is budgeting to do that work 10 years from now. Well, the board that's in place today might be tempted to say, look, it's 10 years from now. We can get away with doing a lower level of funding for the next 9 years if in our spreadsheet we plug in year 10 a really big number that will pay for the roofs that year. What they're doing in that scenario is committing that future group of owners, right, the people who will be there 10 years from now to pick up the tab. They would be the ones paying that balloon payment. And in turn, that allows the owners in the present day to get by with doing a lesser amount and saving some money. To me, I don't think that's fair. Everybody's getting the same use and benefit of the roof. They shouldn't be sticking it to that future group of owners. I understand why the state doesn't want to allow for that. Well, if you're thinking, well, so what? Well, this is the problem. When it comes to a reserve study, when we talk with associations, we talk with the accountants who are doing their annual audits, the term balloon payment, as it's used in this context, has been interpreted to mean any increase whatsoever in reserve funding from one year to the next is a balloon payment. So, for example, if I tell a client, hey, look, this year you need to contribute $100,000 to reserves, that's based on our analysis using current replacement costs and factoring in remaining life expectancies. But next year, if we assume that costs will go up because of inflation, and we want to help keep up with that assumption for inflation, maybe next year it goes from 100,000 to 103 or 104,000. Then in year 3, okay, if costs continue to go up, you contribute a little bit more to reserves, and so on and so forth. That to me seems reasonable, but the problem that we've run into is that the state and I guess in turn the auditors have said, no way, you can't have any increase at all from one year to the next. That's a balloon payment. And our response is, well, wait a minute. You're allowing us, maybe even encouraging us, to use some assumption of inflation in our studies, meaning the costs of the components that this association is saving up for will be increasing over time. We all agree on that, but now you're telling us that we're not allowed to assume any increase on the other side, on the contributions to reserves. That's a major problem, because now if we all agree that inflation is real and that costs will go up over time, but I'm not allowed to make the same assumption on the other side of the ledger that the cash flow to reserves can also increase. Now I get a problem which gets worse every year, right? It suddenly gets a lot more expensive to make that plan work. I'm allowing the assumption that expenses can go up, but not that income can go up. So in order to meet the same objectives, to have my funding plan meet those criteria, all else being equal, I would have to set the initial contribution rate much higher in the beginning to meet those same objectives, whether it's baseline or full funding. Now, if I do that, that places a very unfair burden on the people who live there now, on those current owners, because in that scenario, they are expected to pay more than they should for reserves. Okay. Now, when we've complained about this, the response is, well, then just take out inflation, right? Don't assume that the costs will go up and that should balance things back out. And this is the part that gets under our skin, right? We're in the business of delivering financial recommendations to clients, and we're now being told that one of the critical underlying factors in those forecasts needs to be taken out. It just doesn't feel right, right? No one in their right mind assumes that something that costs $10,000 today will still cost $10,000 15 years from now. There's really no part of the economy where that's true. But in order to make this kind of funding plan work, it is the only logical conclusion. We have to take out inflation. We have to keep our reserve contributions flat. That allows the funding amount to be appropriate in the present day. So where does that leave us? What does that mean for you guys? Well, this is where you come in, right? The message that we all need to reinforce to associations is that budgeting for reserves is an annual exercise, right? It's not practical to have a reserve study done 1 year and expect that that same document's going to be good for the next 3, 4, 5 years in a row, especially if that doesn't include any inflation. Every association needs to produce a new reserve schedule every year as part of their budget process. And that should always be based on the market pricing for components at that time. That's the only way that they can realistically stay on top of these changes. In the same way that they're having an annual audit done, they should have an annual reserve analysis done, whether that's internal or hiring a company to help with that. That's the bottom line. These are, unfortunate restrictions that we have to work with at this point, and it makes any forecast beyond year one unreliable. Okay, good news is that there are low-cost options for doing reserve studies annually. There's different third-party software programs out there that you can use at budget time. Our hope is that this is going to change. There's a lot blowing in the wind right now in terms of reserve studies and legislation in Florida. But the real takeaway here is that you want to keep in mind that reserve studies have an expiration date. They're only as good as the data that goes into them. And if your community is making decisions based off old or outdated information, that's just not going to end well. Okay, final thoughts before we go to Q&A. Hopefully by now, and I think just again, by the fact that you've attended here today, I think you agree that reserves are very important, both in the present and in the future, okay? When you're designing these annual budgets, think hard, choose wisely about which method you're going to use to do that. And once you've chosen that method, right, if you've committed to pooled reserves, think about what the long-term objective of that plan should be. Just doing the bare minimum is probably not going to be enough, right? I make this point to boards and to clients all the time. When you're designing the budget, the goal of that is not to just keep the dues low and keep the members happy. Okay, it's not to continue the status quo and just make everybody feel good, pat yourselves on the back. That's not how this works. Whether you're a reserve specialist, a property manager, a board member, collectively, this is all of our responsibility to educate the people that we work with and to help them make wise financial decisions. So, with that said, let me take a beat and we will start going through the Q&A. I'll put my email address up on the screen here. I'm also going to launch a poll, so you'll see a set of poll questions come up here in just a moment. I would definitely appreciate everybody to complete that as quickly as you can. So before I do that, Lindsay, any comments from you? Any other questions you want to address, or I can just jump right into to the Q&A?
Yeah, nope. That would be great. We can jump into the Q&A just to let everyone know. I have been responding in the chat for those that needed to receive the link to the May 27th webinar of part one. So I am sending that link out to you all following the conclusion of today's webinar. So thank you again, Will. We really appreciate your time.
Sure. No, thank you. I appreciate you answering those questions. And yeah, I think when we send out the follow-up email, I'll just include links to both to today's class as well as last one. So if you did miss that, no problem. We'll make it easy for everybody to get that information. So thanks for continuing with the poll, and let me just start going down the list here. So okay. Just a couple kind of housekeeping things. So as I'm doing these Q&A questions, I have not seen any of these before. I'm going to do my best to answer them on the fly. If any of these questions are too specific about your particular communities association situation, and I wouldn't be able to answer that question accurately without doing a reserve study for you, then I'll probably have to skip that over. So I'm going to try to keep things as broad and general as I can, and get through as many of these as we can. It's not a terribly long list, so hopefully we can get through all of these. Okay, first question up. Do you need an engineer study prior to doing a reserve fund study? No, a reserve study is, I always describe it as a blend of different skill sets. It's a bit of building science, it's a bit of accounting and finance. I would say that if you have a particular concern at your property for some specific component, right? Let's say you've got spalling concrete, you've got leaks into your parking garage, you've got clearly a structural issue or a potential structural issue, you might want to bring an engineer in or somebody who's qualified to look at that particular problem in more detail and then work that into your overall financial plan, into your reserve study. But you don't need to have a complete CAT scan of your whole building done. And I don't know that you really could anyways, because a reserve study is broader than that. We're looking not just at structural and mechanical things, but also amenity areas, future life cycles for, replacing gym equipment and resurfacing swimming pools. So a reserve study is kind of broader in nature than what you would typically get from a very specific engineering report. But it's meant to tie all these things back together. So if you have had one done, or if you have particular concerns, yeah, you might need to see a specialist, so to speak, for those particular things. But you can do that before or after or concurrently with a reserve study. It doesn't need to be done prior to that. Okay, let's see. In my example of roof reserves where you fund, so this is the straight line example where we had $20,000 each for 3 years, and in 3 years the cost has now increased to $235,000. You still come up short. What then? Well, that's a great question. If it's straight line reserves, and you have a deficit in one account, then the first thing you would probably want to do is see if you can move money from one other reserve account to cover that difference. Maybe you have a surplus in your parking lot or swimming pool or somewhere else that you can move over, and that would require the owners to vote and approve that. The other option is maybe to take out a small loan or pass a special assessment to make up the difference. That way you're leaving your other reserves untouched, right? They still sit there for what they were intended for. But you can pay for that difference without having to, maybe to go outside. It really depends. I would say, again, special assessment is more advantageous than a loan, but often not going to be warmly received. All right, let's see. Another one, I'm going to try to do the math in my head as I read these. So the roof has 20 years lifespan. We are 5 years into its life. We had been using $30,000 as a replacement cost. Turns out the current replacement cost is $80,000 and perhaps will be $120,000 in 15 years when it is due. What do we do now to both fix the 5-year period of underfunding and also plan for inflation expected? It represents a huge increase of annual assessments, right? Yeah, the reality of reserve planning is that you always want to adapt to the current situation as quickly as you can. So if 5 years ago you thought the roof was going to cost 30 grand, now it costs 80. It is what it is. You have to recalculate, go with your assumption for the next 15 years based on at least the new $80,000 amount, but maybe 120. So if you forecasted 120 15 years from now, you can do the same math. You subtract out whatever you have saved and then divide the difference by those 15 years. But I would say along the way, check in with your roofing company each year, monitor that, see if things are changing, and then just course correct as you go along. It's one of the most important things to understand. This is not a once in a generation exercise. Reserve funding and annual corrections and assumptions or adjustments to that need to be done on an annual basis. Think of it like a ship, drifting off course. If it catches itself very quickly, it's very easy to get back on course. If it drifts for 2 weeks, it's going to end up in a different ocean, right? So that's I guess the only important takeaway here is that you want to stay on top of these changes as quickly as you can. Unfortunately, that often means making up for lost time, right? If your prior budget years weren't sufficient, it may be a little bit painful, but what's the alternative? You're just going to inevitably feel that pain in the form of a special assessment if you're not adapting your reserve budgets along the way. Yeah, so again, we'll send out the recordings. Okay, is an owner vote required when adjusting a reserve account, such as raising the roof reserve to keep, from 200,000 to 350,000 to keep up with changes needed? No, you don't have to get the owners to vote if you're just changing the cost assumption. If you're looking at the annual budget, you're coming up with a cost for what you think a project is, and that's higher than what you assumed in the past, the owners don't have to weigh in on that. The only time the owners vote is if you're proposing to do less than full funding, or if you're moving money from one straight line account to another, or moving actual cash from one place to another. But just changing assumptions for life expectancy and costs, that's nothing the owners have to weigh in on. Okay, reserve contributions, can they be increased to accommodate anticipated inflation? If not, how confident can you be of a replacement cost many years down the road? Well, I like the question, and that's part of the problem with this whole balloon payment thing. When you're doing, if I'm doing a study right now for a client, here we are in 2022, and I'm giving them a 30-year projection. In my 30-year projection, I can't show any increases in that plan. But what I would tell them is, look, I'm giving you this for your 2023 budget. Fast forward 1 year from now, if we were looking ahead to 2024, you can absolutely be sure I will have increased my recommendation from now to then, and so on and so on. That's the only way to try to account for what replacement costs will be in the future. You can inflate things from 1 year to the next, but if I sit here in 2022 and do a 30-year projection, that's where the state gets involved and they say, yeah, that's not okay. That's a balloon payment. So again, a frustrating part of doing this right now, but maybe something that'll go away in the future. Okay, if you do the straight line method, can you raise reserve funding from 1 year to the next without having to completely redo the schedule each year? Well, either way, you need to, I guess, redo the schedule, meaning account for the year that's gone by, change your remaining life expectancies, change your replacement cost to whatever is current, right? If a year's gone by and you haven't done that project, you should at least subtract 1 year of life from its value. So in that sense, you do need to redo the schedule each year, and you should be raising your reserve funding accordingly if it's not keeping pace with those projections. So yes, you can and should raise reserve funding from 1 year to the next. And yes, you do need to redo the schedule to kind of show your work and justify why you did that. Okay, reserve studies are expensive. Is there a way to reduce costs when you do it every year? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in our prior class, we talk about the different types of studies. If you've never had one done before, starting from scratch is what's called a full reserve study. That would be the most expensive, most comprehensive option on the table. But let's say that the cost of that is, $5,000 for a property. The following year, if they're just doing a quick update, they would do probably what's called an update with no site visit. For the same property, that might only be $1,200 or $1,500. It's only accounting for 1 year's worth of change, not requiring another site inspection. So yeah, the more frequently you do your reserve studies, hopefully the less expensive they are because there's less data changes to account for. So yeah, I think any reserve study provider would tell you that the first one is typically the most expensive, but then going forward, it does get easier over time. Okay, I didn't understand how pooled funding ends up being less costly than straight line. Can you explain again? Yeah, of course. And I understand that a lot of this stuff is a little bit tricky. It's easy for me because I do this all day, every day, but go back to the buckets of money and just think of, one that's really well funded, one that's got next to nothing in it. If I'm preparing my annual budget, I have to look at each one in a vacuum, right? So I'm looking at this bucket of money all by itself, not considering that there's money possibly available somewhere else that could be made available for that project if only the funds were combined. That's what happens when you pool the reserves. To me, the phrase I always use, it's a more efficient distribution of the total cash on hand, right? So explain it maybe another way. Let's say as an individual, if you had 10 different checking accounts instead of one, you have one checking account for going to Publix for groceries, you have one for your FP&L bill, you have one for your car payment, one for insurance, and so on. And every month, as you're looking at your expenses, you're having to move money from one checking account to another to cover some cost. Instead, if you just looked at the total combined sum of all your money in one place and consider that it's all collectively available for any bill you have to pay, then you're not worried about moving money from one place to another. And if you can't move money from one place to another, having to come up with the difference somewhere else, right? That's really the problem, is you've got owners who would have to vote to move money from one place to another. And if they can't get the quorum or don't pass that vote, now you're special assessing for something that you wouldn't have had to if you could just combine all the money together. So I understand it's a complicated topic. I'm trying to do my best to explain it, but it is a tricky one. Okay, let's see. Roof contractor warrants roof for 30 years, but insurance requires roof replacement every 20. Is it standard MO to use 20 years lifespan, and is there another way? Generally speaking, warranties are not the same as useful life assumptions. Okay, if you read the fine print on a warranty, you're going to find that usually there's a lot of ways to wiggle out of that. Sometimes the warranty just covers material, for example, and not labor. So if you have a roof leak, maybe the warranty provides you with some, square footage of material that they will send to the site, but you still have to hire a roofing company to go out there and do the job. So, sometimes there's a labor warranty as well, but even with those, the fine print is usually pretty interesting to read. There's an industry organization called the NRCA, National Roofing Contractors Association. On their own website, they actually have a consumer bulletin, which basically talks about roof warranties and why they're often not worth the paper that they're written on. If your insurance company is going to cancel your policy if you don't replace it every 20 years or whatever it is, kind of doesn't matter what the roofing company has to say. The insurance companies are the ones that kind of lead the charge in that way sometimes. Let's see, if our reserves are woefully underfunded, how much can you do for a special assessment? The association doing a loan versus each individual owner doing a loan. That's kind of a unique situation. I would have to know more about it to give you more specific guidance. But I would tell you again, special assessments to me are preferable to loans because ultimately they are less costly. You're not paying the interest. Another point to make for your board members out there is that a special assessment, it shouldn't usually come as a surprise. It's almost always the inevitable result of having not budgeted sufficiently in prior years. So if your owners are up in arms about a special assessment, oftentimes you can point out to them, look, for the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, our budgets were not as high as they should have been. You have enjoyed a lower cost of ownership up to this point, but now we have work to do and we don't have enough money to do it. So we got to pass the hat. We have to pass this special assessment. That is the catch-up contribution that is offsetting all the prior years when we didn't have enough in our normal budget. Whether you decide to do that as a loan, as an association, or each individual, I would say if it's the association's bill to pay, the association should take out the money to do it. Because remember, when owners come and go from a property, they're taking their finances with them. So if some owner out there, whether it's special assessment money or a loan, if they sell their unit and move away, if they take the money with them, then that doesn't really help the association at that point. So first line of defense, I think, would be a special assessment, and those can be pretty pricey. Next best thing would be the association taking out a loan or a line of credit for the same work. Okay, in a straight line method, can't you make a capital improvement fund that allows you to use money for various needs? I wouldn't do that. Part of the reason is that, in our first class, we talked about the definition, the criteria for a reserve component requires that it has to have a predictable remaining life expectancy. Everything has to be tied back to a reality, a useful life, a remaining life, and a cost for a specific scope of work. Opening the door to just general capital improvements or contingencies kind of removes the accuracy from that. You're creating like a slush fund for stuff that shouldn't be there. Now, you can do that on the operating side of the budget, or you can have a credit line available for things that don't meet the definition of a reserve component, but I would not use reserves to create just a miscellaneous fund or capital improvement fund, because how do you figure out the life expectancy and therefore the cost and therefore the amount of funding required for that thing, unless there's some scope of work you're actually targeting there. So yeah, it can be done, but I wouldn't do it as a reserve component. Put a contingency line item in your operating budget. That's the better way to tackle that. Okay. Should a reserve be established to cover a hurricane insurance deductible? Similar answer to the last one. We talked about this in the other course as well. In order to be a reserve component, something has to have a predictable remaining life. Otherwise, you're just making a wild guess as to how often it occurs and what it's going to cost you, and that will blow up your plan, because we're looking for things that have predictable recurring life cycles. We don't know how often you're going to have to pay your deductible, so it shouldn't be a reserve component. You can do that as an emergency fund, an emergency line of credit, a surplus in operating. I think those are all good ideas. It's Florida, hurricanes will be inevitable. You're going to have to pay that deductible at some point, but just don't treat it as a reserve component. That's not the best way to handle that. If we need to redo reserves for roofing because of new costs, would the annual increase be considered balloon payments? Yeah, it's just, if you're proposing funding that increases from one year to the next as part of your current fiscal year's plan, you're not allowed to do that. But from one year to the next, as you fast forward and prepare each individual year's budget, then you can redo your reserve. You can increase that amount of funding. There's no problem with that. Okay, let's see. I've still got 8 open questions. I'm going to try to get through these next 5 to 10 minutes. Make sure we don't keep everybody on the line. I do appreciate everybody, by the way, finishing the poll. Thank you for that. Okay, if you're in a very small building, say 24 units, and your largest expense is roof and insurance and limited other expenses, concrete restoration, etc., do you need a formal study, or can you simply get updated cost and input to Excel? Yeah, at this point in time, if you're a small building and you have accurate data, you don't necessarily need to hire a third party to help you with that. Now, we haven't really talked about it today because it's still very new, but there is new legislation that just passed in Florida that is purporting to require what they call a structural integrity reserve study that all condos and co-ops are supposed to get done in the next 30 months. It's a very impractical piece of legislation. I don't think it's really going to be possibly to implement that as it's currently written. I do expect at some point that reserve studies by a third party may be required in Florida. In the meantime, if it's that simple of a property and you have faith that you can get accurate data, it's not rocket science to put together a budget. But if you're unsure of that, if the board's not wanting to take on that liability, then getting some professional advice might be a good idea. Okay, some of these I think I've kind of already answered, so I'm going to skip through them. Can reserve buckets be re-identified as to purpose without owner approval? I don't believe so. I think if you've designated a reserve account for some specific thing, whether that's elevators or roofing or what have you, I don't think you can just change the name of the bucket and keep the same amount of money there. That's a good question. I would probably defer to an attorney on that, but I don't believe that would fly. Let's see. Yeah, the new law passed in May, is that going to have an effect on required reserves? Honestly, we're probably going to develop a whole new 1-hour class just talking about this new legislation. The bill, as Senate Bill 4 that just passed late May, is definitely going to have a big impact on required reserves. There's some good things in the bill that we fully support, milestone inspections for buildings. They're going to eliminate the waiving of reserves. Okay, so if you're in a community out there that has waived reserves forever and ever, that's not going to fly anymore. Associations should never, ever be doing that. It's ridiculous that they ever allowed it in the first place. But yeah, the reserve funding will be required. Some of the details of how often and by what date you need to comply and whether or not you need a reserve study. These are things that are part of the bill as well that I expect will probably change. But yes, it's a new day in Florida, and I would guess within the next 6 to 9 months, we'll probably have a new, even more updated legislation that might clarify some of these requirements. But yeah, there's a lot that's changing right now. And stay tuned. Like I said, we'll have a new class coming out to address that. Okay, does it make sense to have a combination of methods, i.e. straight line and pooling, say call it general reserve to meet any surprises and or missing funds to meet any of the components buckets? Again, I guess you could have a combination of straight line funds for certain things and a pooled account for everything else. But in that pooled account, it still needs to be justified by a specific list of things with dedicated life expectancies and cost estimates. So yeah, a pooled reserve, in other words, is not a slush fund. It's not just money you can use for anything that you want. It still has to be tied back to an economic reality of individual scopes of work. Okay, is there a limit on how much a special assessment can be? Well, I guess we'll end on that. Not to my knowledge. No, I've seen special assessments that are tens of thousands of dollars per unit, maybe even 6 figures per unit. I don't believe there's any statutory or other cap on how much a special assessment can be. And that's really the whole point of this exercise, is to try to prevent that from happening by having good, healthy reserve contributions over the course of time to prevent that from happening. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. It's about 20 after the top of the hour. Really appreciate everybody tuning in. Feel free to share this information. As I said, we will have a follow-up email going out. Oops, turned off my thing there. That's what I meant to do. We'll have a follow-up email coming out with the links to this class and the prior class. Please feel free to share that with everybody that couldn't attend it. If you've got colleagues, coworkers, fellow board members, committee members, this is all public information. And yeah, on behalf of Seacrest and our company, Association Reserves, just want to thank everybody, and hope to see you next time. Thank you again.